Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
A Steampunk Fairy Tale. Snow. Part 3. Chapter 9. By Joy Finlay. Hunter left Edison as her faithful guardsman. He came down with water and food and a change of clothes, men's breeches, shirt, and a work coat. She hid her hair under an old engineer's hat and kept her head down low when they passed others in the tunnels. Edison, although a good for a guard dog, made her more conspicuous. So Hunter took the dog back to his home for safekeeping. While she hid in the engineering underbelly of Skylands, sounds of engineering work gangs and groups of coolies passed her by. Clanging boots on metal floors, tools clanging, voices laughing, loud and rowdy noises, echoing through the metal tunnels, oftentimes giving her cause for moving about to find more suitable hiding places. On one such move, she rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of rather small men, all covered in black from the top of their heads to the shoes of their feet. All she could make out in the dimness of the tunnel lights were the whites of their eyes and bright white teeth when they smiled at her, bobbing their heads and moving past her as she pressed her back up against the tunnel wall. She held her breath until the last man passed with a nod of his head, then let it out in a whoosh, turning quickly to lose herself in the blackness again. It was 2 days before Snow saw Hunter again. She started to worry that he would get caught, or that she'd get lost again, and he wouldn't be able to find her. "I'll always find you, Snow. Don't fret so much," he told her. "I've sent word to your father, but with Raina's spies everywhere, I'm not sure the message will make it landside." He watched her eat, a sad expression on his face. He threw a bright red apple up and caught it, over and over again, as if trying to make a decision. "Raina called me into her drawing room last night, Snow." She paused her eating to look at him. "She asked me to find you, and to poison you." He threw the apple up again and caught it again. It was exactly like the apple she had just taken a bite from, bright and shiny and red. It looked and tasted absolutely delicious. She stopped taking a second bite, trying to spit out what she'd already eaten. She was betrayed. Tears threatened. She trusted him. He wouldn't hurt her. He couldn't hurt her. She couldn't say a thing. He looked over his shoulder and looked back. His eyes changed, a pained look entering them. "She knows you're down here." He quickly gathered all the supplies she had, shoving them in a rucksack. He hit the apple out of her hand, and she stood there stunned, not quite believing what he'd done. "You have to run, Snow. Find some lost corner down here, and don't come out." He pushed her towards another service tunnel that became blurry and shifted into 2 tunnels. "Hunter?" She tried to figure out what had just happened. "Keep running, Snow. Don't look back." His words, surrounded by other men yelling. She turned and ran as fast as she could, dropping the rucksack somewhere along her way, stumbling over her own feet. She heard the echo of shouting men, turned to find Hunter running towards her as her vision doubled. She was in trouble, so very tired, and she didn't know where she was going. She found a water pipe opening that dropped meters into swirling water below, making her pause. Terrified, she felt she had no choice, and climbed up into the mouth of darkness. Someone caught her coat, yelling echoed through her head as she fell down. She heard her own voice involuntarily scream. Water rushed into her mouth, skin stinging with 1,000 freezing cold knives, hands grabbing her and holding her tight. Then darkness. Chapter 10. Time melted away. She tried to wake but couldn't open her eyes. Watery broth filled her mouth, followed by a sip of bitter water. The sensation was quickly followed by violent shaking, though no one touched her. She had little control over the convulsions that racked her small frame, but once they settled, she was given more to eat and drink by an unknown hand. She said thank you before sleep came to her again. I will always find you, Snow. Be brave. I love you, Snow. Always know that. If I ever see that mutt again, I will put it out of its misery. She woke with a start and found herself buried beneath blankets and sacks, surrounded by boxes of foodstuff. Shh, lovely, came a whispered voice. To her left she found a small, grubby fellow with a head too large for his shoulders, his fingers to his lips. He pointed through a gap in the mountain of boxes towards a door that was slightly ajar. There she saw the legs and bodies of guardsmen and heard raised voices demanding to know where she was. Other small fellows were arguing with the guards, saying there was no one hidden there, that they were late for their shift and threatened that if they didn't get it going, then the city would fall out of the sky. This caused everyone to move quickly from the room beyond where Snow was, much to her relief. The name's Pat. The voice startled her again. She turned to the small fellow and saw his grin behind the black soot that covered his face. Ain't no one gonna hurt you here, Miss Petto. He knew who she was, and she didn't know what to make of that. She tried to sit up under the weight of her covers, only to have her head start spinning again, which in turn set off a queasy feeling in her tummy. Then she remembered everything. Raina, Hunter, the apple, and, unfortunately, the swim in the darkness. "Oh, goodness," she said before the churning in her stomach leapt up her throat and splashed down her front. "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she said as the gentle hands mopped a clean cloth over her face. "Shh, 'tis nothing. We'll get you cleaned up in no time." She let the little man help her take her overshirt off. She wore women's clothes underneath that she didn't recognize and blushed at the thought of strangers dressing her. "Whose clothes am I wearing?" she whispered. "No need to fret, missy. We've had Mrs. Marta come to clean you up. We're well-bred, if not well-behaved gentlemen. You're quite safe with us." He tucked her in again, his kind smile the last thing she saw before sleep caught her again. It was a few more days in her makeshift bed before Snow's strength returned. She spent much of that time learning about her unusual heroes. They were 7 short, little men in total, all of them no taller than her shoulders. They were coalies, men who stacked the engine boilers full of coal to keep the engines hot and the steam city afloat. Black as black, they were constantly covered in soot, working shifts about to keep the engines running. They kept Snow hidden for 3 weeks before more of Raina's men showed up again. "Snip, we've got company," said Nick, as he shoved her through the coalie dormitory door towards the bunk beds. He opened an old chest, put a bundle of dirty laundry out of it before helping her back in, with an apology on his face. He piled the clothes back over her, closing her in, and sat on top of it as larger men stomped through the hall. She heard, trying not to giggle, Nick's attempt at an outraged bluster while sitting above her, probably with his shirt off. The outburst was enough to move the guards on to the next room. She stayed there until the lid was lifted and Nick said it was all clear. She loved these burly, hot-tempered little men. They had taken her in, knowing full well that the Queen of Skylands was offering a reward for her capture. They called her Snip to keep others from overhearing her name, and because they were a bit like that. All of them were called by a nickname, and she knew very few of their real names. They loved to work, loved to eat, and they loved to joke with each other. Quite a large family, Snow imagined. They each told stories about each of their tattoos they wore, talked about childhood antics as little people, reminiscing about childhood crushes before they started bellowing out ballads of unrequited love. They shared a lifetime of experience that Snow had never even imagined were confined within the walls of the floating city. More and more she found herself laughing or hugging or, heaven forbid, punching a fellow collie as she grew to love her new friends. She accidentally confessed to them one day that she knew very few cuss words, which they immediately tried to correct, causing her ears to burn and her face to blush. Pat stepped in, smacked those closest to him over the head, telling them to shut their cake holes. She bit her lip and then cracked up laughing. In return for their protection and kindness, she kept their laundry clean and food on the table. They loved her cooking and thanked her for her help. Tom piped up and joked that if she ever wanted to give up her life of crime, that she always had a job there as their cook. She laughed at this, but it was a sad reminder of her current situation. Tom was thumped for the comment, oblivious to her pain. The subject was changed to lighten the mood. She was sketching with Cole one afternoon. Tom and Nick swore she drew just like the artist in the paper, the White Maid. She quickly rubbed the coal off the table, denying it. But when she tried to change the subject suddenly, they hassled her all the more. The next day a real sketch pad and pencils graced the kitchen table, which touched her heart immediately. She had fun hearing their stories and sketching them. She'd leave the sketches on the table overnight, only to find them gone and in the local paper the next week. Chapter 11. "What are you going to do, miss?" It was a question from out of the blue. She turned to find Pat sitting at the kitchen table, watching her work in the small galley. "I'm going to make dumpling stew, and then clean up the mess in the den," she replied. "You can't stay here forever, Snip." "I know," was her small reply. She moved the large pot of water from the table to the hot stove. It was heavier than she intended. It slipped from one hand, so she caught it against herself to keep from falling. "Let me help with that," he said, and stepped in to take the pot from her and placed it on the stove. "You shouldn't be here doing this. You should be in the tower with your family and your social friends." He sighed a heavy sigh. "She will kill me, Pat." Her voice smaller again. Pat turned the stove on to heat the meal through and moved to sit beside the dark-haired beauty at the kitchen table. "You said Raina had a ledger. Why don't we find that and take it to the authorities?" He knew her rebuttal, having had this conversation before. "She is the authorities, Pat. She has either paid everyone off or has removed them from the city. My father was the last to go." She wiped a stray tear, then another. "There must be something we can do. What about the White Maid? Can we use that avenue?" "She made the editor discontinue publishing the sketches after she threatened to pull the advertising revenue. She controls the press, the police, and the sky docks. There's nothing I can do." She looked into Pat's kind and worn face. He had become like a father to her over the last few months, and without him she would probably be dead by now. "Can't I just stay down here with you?" she implored. "Snip." "Snow." You are a brilliant daughter of the most incredible mechanical engineer in the world has ever seen. You're not meant to be hid out here in the bowels of this hulk of metal. You were born to be kind and creative and cook amazing stew." His eyes twinkled, satisfied he'd brought a small smile to her face. "But how, Pat? My father is being fed lies of my whereabouts. The whole city is on alert for my arrest, and goodness knows where Edison is." "What about your friend Hunter? Any word from him?" He raised an eyebrow in challenge. She swallowed down the bile that threatened her throat and stood up from her seat. "I will not talk about Hunter. He cannot be trusted." She turned to stir the stew. "Your last sketch for the paper was of Raina with her ledger. Hunter knows to look for it." "Hunter can just go and—" She paused and swallowed down a cuss word. "Hunter betrayed me. He was the one that poisoned me and left me for dead. You saw what one bite of that apple did to me. I was sick for days." "Aye, lassie, I was there, remember?" "But he warned you, stopped you from eating the whole thing and told you to run." He was standing in front of her now, with his hands on his hips. "He is your only hope." "I know," she sighed, resigning to the fact and hating the whole situation. What if we get Nick to get word to him? Tell him you're after the ledger and you need his help," he suggested. As if on cue, Nick barged into the kitchen quickly, grabbed a large cloth for around his waist, and pushed a wide-eyed Snow under the bench beside the stove. She curled herself up into a ball as tight as she could to keep anyone from spotting her. "It needs more salt," he yelled at Pat, who in turn dipped a finger into the stew to taste it, just as Raina's guard stomped into the room. "I put plenty of salt in, you brat." And they continued to argue about the stew, the mess in the galley, and whose turn it was to do all the dishes. The guards left the quarters, but not before knocking around a few coalies and pitching a pile of clean laundry off a bench or two. "They still looking for her?" came Tom, Hick, Book, and Tea. "Yep," came Nick's reply as he moved the hot stew from the stove to the table, and they all sat down. The conversation with Pat had left her a little raw. Snow stayed curled in a tight ball until the tears had dried up. She put a foot out and then an arm before Book, the only one who wore glasses, helped her up and sat her beside him and Tea at the table. "Might be a bad time to show you this, then," said Tom as he dropped a paper on the table. It didn't take long for Snow to realize he was referring to the poor imitation of a white-maid sketch. It was Hunter, in chains, at a seaside dock. A message for Snow. A message she understood all too well. The Queen would either have Hunter's freedom or hers. So quoth this raven. My dears, I should have the final installment next week of this. It's such a fun fairy tale. I hope you've all enjoyed it. If you have, let me know, and I will send word to Joy and see if she'll let me do any more of these, because she's got a whole slew of them. Go to her page on Wattpad, and you can read them for yourself. Like this video, so I know you liked it. If you comment, I will do my best to comment back. I adore talking to you guys. Subscribe if you have not done so, and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will see you next time on Tuesday. Bye-bye, my darlings.